también a los que nos están siguiendo virtualmente desde casa. Quiero agradecer, empezando con World Future Society, Capítulo Mexicano, está aquí el presidente Ramón Santoyo. También agradecer a Sergio Alcocer de COMEXI, que junto con la Embajada de Italia organizan este evento. Es un evento personalmente extremadamente interesante, que tiene un tema fascinante, que es la evolución de la relación entre China y Estados Unidos. Es una relación muy importante porque, incluido hoy, hay algunos observadores que la simbolizan como el nuevo modelo de relación internacional. Una posición, no es un término que me gustó mucho, digamos un nuevo mundo bipolar donde por un lado hay las democracias occidentales, por el otro lado hay algunos países cuya importancia crece día a día, que se inspiran a modelos de gobierno, a modelos culturales, tienen sociedades diferentes. Me parece sumamente importante que esta charla se dé aquí en México, porque de la relación, de la evolución de la relación entre Estados Unidos y China, no sé políticamente, pero seguramente desde un punto de vista económico y comercial van a caer muchos efectos también por México. ¿Por qué organizamos este evento? Porque tenemos dos ponentes de primera clase, Federico Rampini y Leonardo Curcio. Federico, desafortunadamente, no podemos disfrutar de su presencia todos los días, y entonces cuando me llamó hace un mes y medio para decirme que venía a México para pasar algunos días de vacación, e inmediatamente coincidimos que era una ocasión demasiado buena para gastarla, de organizar un momento de comunicación pública sobre un asunto que, como he dicho, es muy importante para México, donde pero me parece aquí en México la reflexión está limitada a círculos muy cerrados de expertos. ¿Por qué hemos elegido este tema? Porque Federico, periodista, me parece una definición demasiado limitante. Periodista seguramente ha colaborado con varios medios italianos y después una larguísima trayectoria de corresponsal desde el extranjero en Bruselas, en París, en San Francisco, en Beijing, 5 años, creo al inicio del milenio, años fundamentales de transformación de China para comprender lo que es China hoy. Y desde más de 10 años ha vuelto a Estados Unidos, a Nueva York, donde vive y trabaja con Stefania, su esposa, que está aquí con nosotros esta noche. Y entonces es un observador privilegiado, un observador que se ha sentado en primera fila para comprender lo que hoy son las dos grandes superpotencias. Más que periodista intelectual, escritor de muchos libros de mucho éxito, traducidos en idiomas extranjeros. También he descubierto ayer, creador de obras teatrales, profesor en instituciones académicas importantes como Berkeley, como la Universidad de Shanghai, como la Bocconi en Italia, y al final actualmente miembro del Council on Foreign Relations en Estados Unidos. Leonardo aquí no necesita ningún tipo de presentación. Tenemos otro intelectual de primera clase, otro periodista de actividad incansable, escritor de libros de mucho éxito, investigador, profesor a las universidades, a varias universidades. Entonces, yo espero que se va a crear un armonioso debate entre los dos y que nos puedan estimular con preguntas. Hemos previsto un espacio para que tanto los participantes aquí en la sala como los que nos están siguiendo virtualmente puedan hacer preguntas. No quiero gastar más tiempo, tengo que hacer un disclaimer porque son dos grandes intelectuales, pero son también librepensantes, que no es la condición, desafortunadamente, de la cual disfruto yo. Entonces, todas las opiniones que serán expresadas durante este evento son claramente de los dos ponentes y no necesariamente reflejan la visión o el pensamiento ni de la Embajada, ni del gobierno italiano, ni de las otras dos instituciones que coorganizan hoy. Bueno, sin más, a vosotros la palabra y el micrófono. Muchísimas gracias.
Muchas gracias, embajador. Pues buenas tardes, me siento muy afortunado de estar aquí y tener la oportunidad de comentar este extraordinario libro que acaba de publicar Federico Rampini. La mecánica es muy simple, le vamos a rogar a Federico que haga uso de la palabra durante media hora, más, lo que decida, y posteriormente entraremos a un diálogo en el que naturalmente están todas y todos ustedes invitados. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And first of all, I need to apologize. I am not able to speak to you in your language. I'm very sorry about that. I should be able, and in fact, I tried to persuade my wife, Stefania, who is a fluent Castigliano speaker, to make this lecture instead of me, but she wouldn't. So you will have to accept my English. I'm sure you have your English is as good as mine, so it shouldn't be a problem. I am very grateful, very grateful to my dear friend, the ambassador of Italy, Luigi De Chiara. And I'm also very grateful to COMEXI and the World Future Society for your hospitality. I'm honored. And by the way, this is for Stefania and myself, the opportunity to revisit Mexico City 40 years after our first trip. We were not even married, we were just engaged. And it was one of our first trips abroad. Ciudad de Mexico has changed pretty much for the best. It's a fantastic city, very exciting, and it's a marvelous experience to be here. So I'm ready to start whenever the slides can appear on the screen. I'm not anymore with La Repubblica. In fact, I very recently changed. I couldn't change quickly enough my presentation. I'm now with Corriere della Sera, which is the largest daily newspaper in Italy, based in Milan. But anyway, I've been with La Repubblica for 25 years. Next slide, please. So what I will do quickly enough is to explain to you, first of all, the Chinese perspective on this historical era when we are talking about competition between the United States and China, maybe even a challenge or a confrontation. We might sometimes fear that a second Cold War has begun between the two superpowers. So let me start, next slide please, with the perspective. In my book, I almost impersonate Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, I imagine what he is thinking about the United States, the Western countries, and what he would say to us. And, you know, the title of my book is very provocative. It's very aggressive. Fermare Pechino, stopping Beijing. Is it possible? Maybe I should have added a question mark. Is it even desirable? But the point of view of the Chinese is, do you really believe that you can stop China or contain China? You will end up living under a benevolent Chinese emperor who will bring you the benefits of a superior civilization. You cannot stop, you, the Western people, cannot stop the long march of history. Next. Because they, Chinese people, and Xi Jinping is obviously very, next please. Xi Jinping is obviously the incarnation of the new self-esteem of the Chinese people. They know how old their history is. For instance, when we talk about the Silk Roads connecting the Far East to the Mediterranean Sea for transportation, not only of silk, but spices, precious metals, they existed even before the foundation of ancient Rome. Next. And so Rome had a very familiar problem. The Roman Empire had a trade deficit with China. Although they didn't really know that China existed. They knew that silk came from a faraway country. There were a lot of legends about the people producing the silk. But anyway, Rome had a real problem, like the United States today, of a trade deficit with China. Next, please. The Chinese, and here you can see, if you look at the slide, it's still the thought of Xi Jinping that I'm interpreting for you. They have a consciousness of the continuity of their civilization, that they are the only example on earth of a people that can say that they belong to the same culture and civilization at least since 35 centuries ago, 3,500 years ago. Next, please. I'm going quick, so you better follow. So we, the Italians, for instance, we are very proud about our history. We believe we are the descendants of Rome, okay? We are not really. There's not the same continuity that the Chinese have with their ancient dynasties, because we don't speak the same language as the Romans, we don't speak Latin, we don't even have the same religion. We switched from a pagan, polytheistic religion to Christian religion. So in China, there is more continuity in cultural terms. Next, please. And thinking of political science, we, the Italians, we tend to believe that modern political science was founded by Niccolò Machiavelli. And even in many US universities, they teach Machiavelli as the founder of modern political science. Well, unfortunately, he's not. Confucius, who lived 6 centuries before Christ, founded the political science that today influences 2 billion people. Because today, not only the Chinese, also the Japanese, the South Korean, Vietnamese people, Singapore people, they're all under the influence of the Confucian thought. And it's very important. For instance, when we look at how they've been able to manage in very different ways the pandemic, the Confucian sense of discipline, respect of the rules and of the authorities is very important. Next, please. So China has always had this idea that they have a superior civilization. It sometimes can even sound like a kind of ethnic racism. But anyway, it's the self-consciousness, the self-esteem of a people who think that they are the center of the world. If you know some Mandarin, Zhongguo, China in Mandarin, means the middle earth, the center of the earth, the center of universe. Next, please. And how they see us. And here, when I say us, I'm not anymore Federico Rampini, the Italian speaking. I'm with my other citizenship. I have dual citizenship. I am also a US citizen. I'm speaking as a US citizen. How Xi Jinping sees the United States today, it's chaos, anarchy. He tells that. He's very outspoken. When he speaks about Western liberal democracies, he's very negative, very critical. He sees the United States as a completely divided society with tribes, political tribes fighting each other. Next, please. And so, the upshot, the conclusion is those who bet against China, against the ascent of China, are on the losing side of history. Next, please. Now, let me try to see in another perspective. I'm trying now to imagine the response of my President Joe Biden to this Chinese perspective on the world affair. Next, please. So, Biden is not really an advocate for a new Cold War. He rejects the definition of himself as a Cold Warrior. And he knows that there is a risk when one great power is in decline and one new power is ascending, that the two can fight each other in a military war. There's a theory, it's been made popular by a political scientist at Yale University, Graham Allison, about the Thucydides trap. So Thucydides was this historian in ancient Greece who studied the war between Sparta and Athens, and how the mechanic, how it can happen, that there's also an inevitability of war when one established power is declining and one new power is rising. So the Thucydides trap is this logic that brings towards war. Now, Biden would say he doesn't want war. He is not trying to go to war with China. Next, please. Today, you all are very well aware that Biden is considered as a weak president. He's been president for just a little more than 1 year, and already he's down in the polls. Let's say the current analysis, whether you are a Republican or a Democrat, is rather critical on Biden. And even his own fellow Democrats are pretty much disappointed. Next. Well, this is about some peculiar similarities between Biden and Xi Jinping. Both have had very tragic lives, very tragic. You know probably everything about Biden. Xi Jinping was a typical victim of the Cultural Revolution. His father was imprisoned, was in disgrace during the Mao Zedong years, although he was a very important political figure. Next, please. Biden's model is obviously Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He said so many times. His dream is to make a new experiment similar to the New Deal in the 30s. The New Deal policies, those policies with which Franklin Delano Roosevelt fought against the Great Depression. So basically, it's restoring a strong government in America to fight against inequalities, economic stagnation, and also to be a better competitor against China. Next, please. Now, what is interesting in the Biden experiment, although it's a very controversial experiment, is how much Biden is trying to learn from China. Listen, I quote here one of his speeches about renewable energies. You know, renewable energies, that's one of the main challenges for the economic competitiveness of the United States. And China is ahead. China is now #1 in solar energy, wind power, electric vehicle production. And China is trying also to have a kind of monopoly in those mineral resources that are essential to produce batteries for electric vehicles. So Biden said there is simply no reason that blades for wind turbines can't be built in Pittsburgh instead of Beijing. So Biden wants to react to the challenge coming from China, and sometimes he's trying to use the same tools, the same policies, strong industrial policies, public governmental subsidies to industries. Next, please. So this is a little bit of a paradox that we've lived under 30 years in a world, or more, even more than 30 years maybe, in a world where China was mostly copying the United States. Now it's sometimes the reverse, the opposite way around. That the United States is trying to learn something from the Chinese textbook and to copy some of the recipes that were so successful in China. Next, please. They also have, those two leaders, they have also, sorry. They also have similar problems. And I would just quickly resume some of these inequalities. There are huge inequalities in the United States, but also in China. And this is why both these two leaders, so different among them, have one thing in common. They are rejecting the neoliberal consensus that was dominant when Ronald Reagan started it in the 80s in the United States, but that was also shared by by Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping, who transported China from a communist world to a capitalist market economy, was somehow an admirer of Ronald Reagan. And he was sharing the same thought. When the tide grows, it lifts all boats, the millionaires' yachts and the fishing ships. That's not anymore the leading thought neither for Biden nor for Xi Jinping. They're now focused on reducing inequalities, and that's one reason why now you see in China a revival of Maoism. It's not the real Maoism, but it's just a signal that Xi Jinping is sending to his population that he wants to care more about the lower classes. Next, please. And, you know, for both leaders, the turning point was 2008, the big financial crisis, initiated by the subprime mortgage crash in Wall Street. So this is the moment that the repudiation of the neoliberal model starts in the United States, and you have all the new leaders of the, the radical left, like Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, and more recently, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. They start being influential with the crisis of 2008. But something very similar happens in China, when 2008 is like an epiphany. The Chinese leaders, the Chinese communist leaders, have a revelation that the United States is a sick country. It's a weak model. It's a capitalism that cannot govern itself. And so they start saying openly that their political system is superior to any liberal democracy. Next, please. So that's when you see all these new movements in the United States. There are a number of faces that you might recognize. The most popular among young people in the US is AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the new left. That is very influential, but also is making a lot of problems for Joe Biden. Inequalities are a big issue in China too. China has become a country divided. They have a billionaire class, almost as rich as Jeff Bezos, Warren Buffett, Bill Gates. They're just a little less famous in our countries, but Jack Ma of Alibaba is the equivalent of Jeff Bezos in the United States. And they still have, for instance, a population of around 370 million migrants who commute from rural areas to the cities to work in big factories. So the problem of inequalities is very, very important in China too. And China has started reducing inequalities by raising their salaries. That's one of the reasons that might be interesting for the Mexican economy too. China is not anymore just the big factory of the world, basing its competitiveness only on low labor cost. Part of the Chinese economy is still linked to that old model, but another part of the Chinese economy has moved on and moved upscale. And the salaries are going up. And that's also one of the reasons behind the global inflation that we are all experiencing right now. Next, please. Another shared issue. I'll be very quick here, but big tech, the excessive power of the digital behemoths like Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Google in the United States, but also the Chinese ones who are as big. Alibaba, Tencent, Baidu, Huawei, and so on. Xi Jinping has started a real, not yet, I'm still with the big tech, but I'll be there soon. Xi Jinping has started an aggressive antitrust policy, and China now, paradoxically, is leading the way in trying to reduce the excessive power of the digital giants, whereas the United States is trying to catch up because antitrust policies have been sleeping in the United States for the last 20 years. And it's a problem for us consumers. Next, please. Climate change. That's also where you find an interesting convergence between the two superpowers. Both Xi Jinping and Biden, both of them, they see this challenge of climate change mostly in terms of the next competition for technological leadership. Everyone wants to be number one in the world, for instance, for electrical vehicles. That's the real challenge. So they want to translate the fight against climate change in terms of wealth and job creation. They don't want environmentalism to be an apocalyptic ideology or an ideology for advocating for the impoverishment. Next, please. I think this is my last one. So this is pretty much the state of the art in the competition between those two superpowers. Biden is somehow engaged in a race not only against time, but also against the worst instincts in his own country. Because the problem, is there another slide, or is this the last one? No, just the last one. So I'll just end with this comment, and I might elaborate if you think it's interesting. The problem that Biden has today is not only the enormous difference in terms of duration, time span. Xi Jinping went to power in the year 2012. He could make 20 years plans. He's still in power now. 10 years later, he will probably be still in power 10 years from now. He's in charge. Biden has such a short time to try to realize his own plans, and he's already lost part of his own political party. And in November, we will vote for the midterm elections. He might lose the majority in Congress. So the time of US politics is so short. But there's another problem that, in my view, is maybe even worse. In the United States, when they face a competitor like China, with that kind of cohesiveness, of self-esteem that the Chinese have, of, national unity, the spirit of national unity. The Americans are the North Americans, the United States, the gringos, the Yankees, are so divided that half of America, the Republican half, thinks that Biden is not even a legitimate president. And the other half, the Democratic half, among them especially the left radicals, the media, the Hollywood establishment, they think that America is the problem. They think that the United States is the empire of evil, that it's the worst possible country in the world in terms of racism, xenophobia, sexism. But it's not easy to fight against, or even to challenge China, to be a tough competitor to China, when your own people think that you are the problem. Thank you for your attention.
The book is compelling. If you are planning to make a career makeover, you should try to be a ghostwriter. I'm sure that Xi Jinping and Joe Biden will be delighted to hire you. But I'm going to switch to Spanish. You understand very well our language. And déjeme poner un tercer elemento sobre la mesa. Esto es un asunto entre periodistas. Ahora volvemos a las relaciones Estados Unidos-China. En algún momento iremos a México. Déjame poner el tercer elemento, the third element, China and Russia. How would you describe the relation between China and Russia these days? A romantic affair, love of spite, amor respeto, a marriage of convenience, and an everlasting love. So what are they planning together, Russia and China?
Matrimonio de conveniencia is the right definition, absolutely. And I thank you for this question, which is so hot. such a hot topic right now, especially with what is happening or might happen in Ukraine. So we have seen, for instance, to give you an example of what what I mean by marriage of convenience, when Vladimir Putin went 1 week ago to Beijing for the Olympic Games. He was the guest of honor of Xi Jinping. And then they published a communique, a joint communique. And, you know, if you read that communique, and you're plenty of important diplomats here tonight, 90% of that communique is Chinese, and only 10% is Russian. I mean, in terms of the content, the political content. So Putin has to embrace the alliance with China because he doesn't really have an alternative.
So it's not an everlasting love. Déjame pasar, Federico, el tema del poder. Vamos a hablar de un asunto, aquí todos son mayores y vacunados, por tanto el tema del poder no le asusta nada. Cuando uno compara, como tú lo has hecho magistralmente en tu libro y ahora en tu exposición, el poder americano y el chino, ve uno que el poder crudo encuentra algunas regularidades. Las potencias tienen su propia lógica y tienden a reproducirse. Pero cuando uno ve con cierta, digamos, meticulosidad la naturaleza o la morfología del poder chino y americano, ve uno diferencias importantes que me encantaría que me ayudaras a entender mejor. Cuando uno ve el poder chino, es un poder vertical, es un poder eficiente, tienen una habilidad asombrosa para edificar infraestructura, lo decías hace un momento, tienen tiempo para planear, tienen 20 años frente a sí, tienen recursos al parecer ilimitados, no transparency, no check and balances, pueden hacer un uso tremendamente eficiente de su poder y dice uno, bueno, pues es ciertamente una propuesta. Cuando uno ve, Federico, el americano, el poder americano es flexible, es mucho más resiliente en los últimos años, tiene alianzas mucho más sólidas, más profundas con sus aliados, empezando por México y terminando por la NATO. Es un poder más sexy, si lo puedo decir así. El famoso soft power de los Estados Unidos es muy fuerte. Considerando estos elementos, Federico, en la carrera para consolidar el poder como superpotencia china, ¿no estaría jugando una lógica suicida, como la hizo la Unión Soviética, o como le ocurrió a la Unión Soviética hace 40 y tantos años? Finalmente, los Estados Unidos tienen una forma de resistir la lógica de una gran carrera por el poder. Me encantaría escuchar tu reacción sobre esta distinta morfología del poder de las dos potencias.
Thank you, Leonardo. You have touched such important issues that it will be difficult to be short, but I will try because I want to listen to you. So I like very much your definition of a vertical power, China, and flexible, resilient power, the United States. I think it's very appropriate, and I also believe that you are right in that there's an implicit skepticism in your question about the eternal ascent or rise of China, because we have seen before monolithic superpowers crumble, and China might crumble. China might collapse because it's typical of an authoritarian regime that they have hidden vulnerabilities that we don't see. We don't see them, or we see very little. For instance, we can mention some of the great, enormous issues that they might confront. One is demographic. They've started, and this is important when we are in such a young country like Mexico. Being young is a fantastic resource in terms of competitiveness. The Chinese are growing old very quickly. They don't make children enough anymore. They have financial issues, big ones, like the real estate. You know, they have real estate financial bubbles that might burst. I mentioned, of course, environmental issues, social problems, the migrants, inequalities. So it is possible that China would meet a crisis, but I don't think that China really compares with the Soviet Union in terms of vertical power, because they were able somehow to foster also their own market economy with their own creativity and innovation and dynamism. The Chinese capitalism is real. It's not just copycat. Yeah. It's real. You know, they can draw from such an ancient tradition of a mercantile capitalistic country. There was one of my favorite authors on the ancient histories, the French historian Fernand Braudel. Fernand Braudel wrote about Chinese capitalism in the 12th century. They already had capitalism even before my own country with Venice, Genoa, and Florence invented capitalism. So let's not underevaluate the special kind of resilience that the Chinese might have. But I am also confident about the United States. I am. I think that the US capitalism is a fantastic resource. And when I was young, I mean, I was young in the 70s, people around the world were already saying that US are dead, that the US is finished, that the decadence of the US is terminal. And then we have seen so many recoveries that we shouldn't lose faith.
These 5 ways, ¿no? Declination. No, yo creo que es un tema muy interesante el modelo chino. Yo lo que siento, Federico, es que le falta atractivo. They have not soft power. No, it's not interesting for others. No es interesante para otros pueblos parecerse a China. El chino es un idioma hermoso, pero endiabladamente difícil. El sistema político chino no entusiasma a nadie. La idea de liberación individual tampoco entusiasma a nadie. Entonces, yo creo que el modelo es muy eficiente, tiene muchas fortalezas, pero la idea de ser atractivos para otros les impide convertirse en una potencia de mayor escala que la que actualmente tiene. O sea, todo sería un tema como de, digamos, capacidad de instalar y sostener valores hegemónicos chinos.
You are right, Leonardo. You are absolutely right. Soft power is still the weak spot of China, whereas it is still a magnificent resource for the United States, although a bit tainted.
For the West as a whole, no?
For the West as a whole, we can speak of the West as a whole. And I myself, I know this is a controversial issue, but I myself include Mexico in the West. Yeah. By all means. Let's not underevaluate the efforts that the Chinese are doing in order to build a soft power. For instance, they are investing a lot in the cinema. One of the chapters in my book is about the new Chinese cinema, how they're trying to countervail, counterattack, or balance the hegemonic power of Hollywood or Netflix or Amazon as producers of imagination, producers. America, North America, US as the factory of dreams, of global dreams. The Chinese are very much laggards. They should still, harder, yeah. But they're investing. I think they want to learn soft power too. And some kind of soft power they're exporting, because in some authoritarian countries, the Chinese model is very attractive. If you look in some parts of Asia, some parts of Africa, they are buying into the Chinese model, even in terms of soft power, because they like that association between authoritarianism and economic dynamism.
Déjame ponerte 2 trampas sobre la mesa, 2 trappole. Una, la de Tucídides, que tú ya has puesto sobre la mesa. Están destinados a confrontarse dos poderes como China y los Estados Unidos. Y yo te pongo 3 escenarios y te pido que los comentes. Por un lado tienes la posibilidad de que las dos potencias, tú decías, aging powers, so they can say, let's be reasonable and put the barbarians in their place. So, una especie de G2, ¿no? Como decía de alguna manera Kissinger, lo sugirió Obama, es decir, una idea de cooperación básica para gestionar los grandes asuntos. Puede ser que se dé en el futuro. La otra posibilidad, segundo escenario, una especie de nueva Guerra Fría, que también lo podríamos tener. Y la tercera, Federico, una especie de híbrido, en donde tú digas, a ver, con esto del nearshoring, tenemos a la subsecretaria que mucho entiende de estos temas, lleva las relaciones comerciales del país, es decir, esta especie de regionalización, de volvamos a estar cerca de nuestros aliados y que cada potencia se divida sus zonas de influencia. Si China tiene capacidad a través de su impresionante obor de controlar una parte de Eurasia, que lo hagan, pero al mismo tiempo América, con sus relaciones europeas y latinoamericanas, forja las suyas. Por tanto, si tú tuvieras que apostar, se dovresti scommettere, o sea, iríamos hacia el híbrido, hacia la Guerra Fría o hacia los próximos años un modelo de cooperación en el que digamos hay demasiados riesgos, somos muy poderosos, somos países que tienen demasiado que perder en una lucha. ¿Tú por dónde irías, Federico? Y después voy a la segunda trampa.
Es una trampa. Definitely, it's a trap because I'm not really able to see into the future. But although the 3 scenarios that you have described, they are all likely. They're all possible. The Cold War scenario, I'm not so against the Cold War scenario because the first Cold War avoided some tragedies. We didn't have a hot war between the United States, direct military confrontation between the US and the USSR. So because China and the US will probably reach in a reasonable future some kind of strategic parity, which seemed far-fetched only a few years ago. But you know, last year, 2021, was the first time that the Chinese military fleet had more ships than the US Navy. Nobody would have believed it possible 10 years before. So they will attain strategic parity. They might be near strategic parity in Asia, in the Indo-Pacific. So a Cold War might be not too bad if it means that they know the risk of mutual destruction, and so they try just to stabilize the confrontation. The hybrid model is probably the more likely one, but in the hybrid model you still have a lot of competition for gaining spheres of influence, and Latin America is a field open for competition. The Chinese are already competing to outdo the US in terms of influence here in Latin America, and this is a very hot topic.
The second trap, la segunda trampa es, si China puede caer como otros poderes en el pasado, tú a lo largo de tus trabajos has recordado a Paul Kennedy, la trampa de la sobreextensión, o sea, ¿a partir de qué momento una potencia como China, que tiene mucho dinero, muchos recursos y mucho tiempo, empieza a plantearse objetivos que rebasan su capacidad de sostenerlos y de apoyarlos? Cuando uno ve el mapa de una China ya gran actor multilateral, jugando en África, jugando en América Latina, acabamos de ver la enorme inversión que le presentó al gobierno argentino en medio de una crisis, cuando los ves jugar en toda la zona, por supuesto, inmediata, adyacente a su territorio, y confrontando a los Estados Unidos en el plano global, te preguntas si no podrían A lo mejor Xi Jinping leyó a Paul Kennedy y lo tiene muy claro, ¿no? Y dice, a ver, la sobreextensión en la que puede caer una China que tiene, como tú bien has dicho, una serie de elementos internos que podrían poner en riesgo todo. Sobre la trampa esta de la sobreextensión, ¿qué me dices?
Leonardo, I'm very glad that you have quoted Paul Kennedy, but I would start the other way around, because right now, la trampa de la sobreextensión is much more a threat to the United States. Right now, if you look at the map of the world and the number of US military bases and the cost of US military bases around the world, the empire that looks overstretched, according to the definition of Paul Kennedy, right now it's rather the United States. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why Joe Biden wanted to get out of Afghanistan. And he was right about that. Then the implementation went very bad. We know the debacle of the Kabul evacuation. But the principle that the United States must stop being the policeman of the world and they must reduce their military overstretch, I think they are more in danger. China, so I'm going to answer about China. China, until now, has been more cautious. They have officially only one military base abroad, far away from their country. This is Djibouti, Gulf of Aden. They're probably building some other military bases. Also, it's not declared such as military in West Africa. They have projects, maybe in Pakistan, but still, until now, the overstretch that you were mentioning is more kind of economic, financial, but this I'm not sure that is exactly what Paul Kennedy would categorize as overstretch, because the Chinese, yes, of course, they're building infrastructures in Africa, in Asia, and even here in Latin America. But they're getting paid. It's not a gift. It's usually loans. They make loans and they want to be paid back. So it's a rather rational and, until now, a rather cautious way to stretch the Chinese empire all over the world.
Última pregunta y después abro, por supuesto, la participación de todos los que quieran formularle una pregunta a Federico. Está el tema, que a mí me gusta mucho, lo cita muy bien Leonardo Morlino, de cómo cambian los regímenes políticos. Él dice que hay básicamente tres vías: una, tratar de conservar el poder que tienes; otra, evolucionar, transiciones graduales; y la tercera, que no es propiamente una elección, que es el colapso. China puede apostar por mantener el poder tal como lo tiene hoy, te pregunto. Tienes un Xi Jinping que ha consolidado un poder personal enorme. Hay un casi culto a la personalidad en el líder chino. Y yo me pregunto, en los países que tienen una alta centralización de poder, aquí tenemos mucha experiencia en ese tema, y tienes un presidente omnipresente, mañana, tarde y noche, hablándote del momento estelar que le toca vivir al país. Si en algún momento la gente dice, oiga, es suficiente tener a Xi Jinping desde el 12 y se nos va a quedar 20 años todos los días y tenerlo, no sé si pudiese uno pensar que en la evolución del sistema chino hubiera una especie de hartazgo, ¿no?, del pueblo, que dijese, ¿sabe qué? Esta figura tan centralizada, tan personalizada, no se ajusta a lo que ha sido la experiencia política china en los últimos años. Te pregunto si esa hipercentralización podría llevar a un colapso o podría dar o abrir paso a una, sucesión ordenada. Aquí también tenemos mucha experiencia. Los regímenes centralizados tienen su punto débil en la sucesión. Es decir, yo soy el gran príncipe Xi Jinping, hombre ilustrado, gran político, tú lo describes muy bien. Pero mi sucesor, question mark, no sé si vaya efectivamente a reunir todo eso. Por tanto, también me encantaría que me contaras un poco cómo están pensando, es un hombre de 70 y tantos años, Xi Jinping, si el tema del relevo no representa la posibilidad de un colapso. Te pongo dos elementos más y te prometo que me callo, les prometo que me callo. Uno es el asunto de la corrupción. En China es un tema muy importante. Con la tradicional repartición de beneficios, el sistema podía tener un cierto equilibrio. También aquí conocemos muy bien eso. Cuando solamente una parte se queda con el botín, con las ganancias, y estas son crecientes, pues un sector dirá, oiga, este juego ya no me está gustando. O sea, ¿por qué hay uno que se lleva todo y hay cada vez menos actores que tienen menos? Por tanto, veo ahí tres elementos de análisis político que me encantaría que me ayudaras a analizar o a revisar con más detalle. Los otros dos son muy sencillos. Uno, China tiene una capacidad hasta ahora increíble de crecer. Yo no sé si esto sea ilimitado. Y sí plantea algunos desafíos. Tú hablas del demográfico, de la forma en que están organizadas las ciudades y las comunidades agrarias. Si eso tiene efectivamente un límite desde el punto, si la elasticidad social da para tanto. Y el último, que es el más conocido para todo aquel que ha tenido la fortuna de visitar China, es la amenaza ambiental. O sea, lo primero que notas son ciudades absolutamente colapsadas por el medio ambiente, los ríos, y uno se pregunta hasta dónde puede llegar eso. Por tanto, te pongo esos tres elementos que te pido consideres y posteriormente pediré a todas y a todos ustedes si quieren formular una pregunta. Federico.
Leonardo, your questions are so important that they might deserve a full conference just to answer your question, but they are really, really important. So let me start with the issue of centralization and the risk of collapse, the scenario of collapse. So first of all, let's be clear that the political system in China is not as stable as it wants to appear. They've had a lot of changes in the 100 years history of the Chinese Communist Party, or in the 75 years of the China People's Republic since the foundation in 49, almost 75. They've gone through a lot of changes, tumultuous changes. Deng Xiaoping, the successor of Mao Zedong, introduced some very important political reforms in order to address exactly the risk of collapse due to hyper-centralization. Deng Xiaoping introduced what they call collegial direction, so a group of leaders, not one single personality, and also the term limit to mandates. Now, Xi Jinping has undone all those changes. We are in the middle of another political reform, which, to my view, is very dangerous, because we are going back to the Mao era with one man in charge, one leader with an enormous concentration of power. And so there's exactly the risk that you mentioned. For instance, what will the succession be? That's the main danger. I don't give a high degree of probability to a scenario of a sudden uprising of the Chinese population against the regime. I think it's more likely that at some point there will be an internal political struggle, a fight for power among factions of the Communist Party. And that is something that we must keep in mind, this possibility. Corruption, the other very important issue that you raised. Corruption is huge in China, but not as huge, I think, as in India, liberal democracy, or in some African countries. Besides, corruption in China does not completely prevent the government to be effective. So it's a strange monster, a strange hybrid, this Chinese political system, with obviously a lot of corruption. When you have a one-party system, corruption is inevitable. But at the same time, they have embraced technocratic values, performance-based measurement of the ability of their leaders, local leaders. So, and last but not least, Xi Jinping says, I am the guy in charge of fighting corruption. And he's tough, he's very tough. He has jailed and even executed with death penalty very powerful bigwigs in his party, even military generals of the army have been executed because they were found to be guilty of corruption. And this is one of the reasons why he's so popular. Never forget, Xi Jinping is a populist. He's the leader of the anti-corruption campaign. He's very clever.
Sounds familiar.
You mentioned, the other issue you mentioned was environment. Of course, that's a huge problem, maybe the most serious danger for the Chinese quality of life. But at the same time, their leadership is very aware. They're investing more than any other country in the world in developing nuclear power, solar power, wind power. They want to be, and they're probably already #1 in the world in terms of volume capacity of production of electric vehicles. And believe me, when I was living in Beijing, 2004 till 2009, there was more smog, more pollution in the skies of Beijing than there is today. So you can see already some change. The last topic I will address among your question is economic growth. It's already slowing down. Probably at the end of this year, I wouldn't be surprised, this year, 2022, I wouldn't be surprised if the growth of Chinese GDP is just 5%, which is fantastic for any other country, but not for China. They are slowly becoming a middle-income country, which means it's not realistic that they continue to grow plus 10%, plus 9%, plus 8%. They know it. They want to change their model of economic. They don't want to be an economy too much dependent on foreign markets, too much dependent on export-led growth. They want to develop internal domestic consumption as the other engine of growth. In the language of Xi Jinping, this is the dual circulation model, where you have also a very strong internal domestic consumption. It's not so easy because one of the reasons is they don't have a welfare system developed as rich countries, which means that the Chinese households tend to save a lot. They want to save because they're not sure they will have a good pension. They're not sure about they will have a good healthcare, public healthcare. So until now, their domestic consumption is not strong enough that it can compensate any loss of foreign markets.
The middle income trap is another interesting trap, pero había efectivamente prometido, me hubiese encantado entrar a eso, si China logrará superar este tema del ingreso medio, ¿no? De esa trampa. Pero abro ahora, tenemos 20 minutos, les voy a rogar que se identifiquen de tal manera que Federico pueda atender directamente su pregunta. Le pido al galardonado periodista Carreño que haga uso de la palabra.
Thank you. I appreciate very much your views about China. I think that I agree almost completely with all of them. But I think that there is one part of the equation that is missing about in your account of the competition, clash, whatever, between China and the US, and it is the domestic policy situation of the United States. I would love to hear your view about what is going on in a country right now that is so politically divided, and where there are bookstores that are opening whole sections about the political crisis. Thank you very much. By the way, José Carreño, columnist general de México.
Okay. ¿Alguien más quiere? Señor Bonfante.
Primero, quiero agradecer a Federico, a Leonardo y a todas las personas, nuestro embajador italiano, que han hecho posible esta bonita conferencia. Las preguntas específicas que yo quiero hacer son de dos tipos. Uno, educación. ¿Cuál es la educación del pueblo chino comparado con la educación del pueblo americano? Y dos, ¿el pueblo está contento en China o está más contento en Estados Unidos? Gracias.
Gracias, ingeniero. Por favor, Damaso. Ah, no, está atrás, me habían pedido antes. Y después, we take one, then you... Por favor.
Muchas gracias, profesor Rampini. Me presento Patricio Garza, gerente de proyectos de Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Foundation. Regresando un poco a este tema de las trampas que bien mencionaba el doctor Curcio, a mí me gustaría ponerle esta cuestión también para ver qué opina. Creo que efectivamente la diferencia que uno encuentra en el modelo chino es que es un gobierno completamente autoritario, totalitario, que supo cómo trasladar o adoptar un modelo capitalista de una forma muy distinta a que lo habían hecho otros modelos autoritarios antes, ¿no? Estaba este debate, por ejemplo, de que los modelos autoritarios justamente sabían de alguna forma, por su planeación y su continuidad, saber adaptar mejor el capitalismo, ¿no? Lo cual nadie había probado como China, ¿no? O sea, con el ejemplo chino. Hay un libro por ahí, por ejemplo, de Danny Roderick, un profesor de Harvard, que escribe mucho sobre este tema, que bien explica justamente esto, ¿no? De cómo otros países, a diferencia de China, toman el decálogo del consenso de Washington para aplicarlo a rajatabla, esperando que funcione, ¿no? Vaya, que se obtenga un crecimiento, una reducción de la pobreza, etcétera. China lo toma, pero no así, ¿no? Adoptando sus propios modelos, su propia realidad, lo cual es muy interesante. Sí. Desarrollando políticas económicas propias que incentivan el mismo comportamiento que uno quiere generar con el consenso de Washington, ¿no? Pero de una forma muy distinta. Mismo camino, forma distinta. Eso, si vamos con la trampa, justamente no podría ser justamente que ahora Estados Unidos esté tratando de reaccionar a eso y que se encuentre de tope en algún momento con que justamente más bien es su mismo modelo democrático el que tiene también algunas trampas detrás que no le permite esa agilidad que tiene China y ese desarrollo que ha alcanzado China, y que eso en última instancia pueda terminar también minando todo lo que ha venido construyendo el sistema americano.
Muy bien. Voy a pedirle al profesor Damaso que haga la última pregunta y dejamos a Federico que cierre, porque son 7:20, tenemos que terminar en 7:30 más o menos. Damaso, por favor.
I just hope you will remember all the questions for me, because I'm trying to keep track.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rampini, for the presentation. You said, and you put on the table, very interesting issues about China. Y yo quisiera pensar en el futuro de China, un poco de sus capacidades internas. Quizá el problema no sea la sobreextensión de China, sino aquellos problemas domésticos que tienen que ver precisamente con su mercado interno, por decir algo. Sabemos que desde 2015 China sobrepasó a los Estados Unidos en su participación en el Producto Mundial, pero no así en su Producto Interno Bruto per cápita, en el que Estados Unidos y Europa como mercado global tienen una diferencia de 2 a 2.5 por encima del ingreso que pueden tener los chinos. Si además pensamos en el COVID y los cambios que se están dando en la estrategia europea de fortalecimiento de mercados internos, en la estrategia norteamericana con Canadá y México de fortalecimiento de mercados internos que parecen que ya no van a mirar tanto a China. ¿Hasta dónde realmente China tendrá esta posibilidad de tener un futuro si cambian o se cierran un poco o un tanto esos mercados tradicionales a los que hasta este momento ha estado explicando? Muchas gracias.
Depende de todo eso. Gracias, Federico.
Okay, all are so interesting questions that I must try to be brief, and you will help me in remembering all of them. If I forget some, you will.
I'll do my best.
Please, Leonardo. So the first one about mainly the domestic issues in the United States. I recognize they're enormous, and I briefly mentioned those issues at the end of my presentation. They're probably more dealt with, more deeply dealt with in my book. I think this is the #1 problem for the United States. I think that the main weakness of the United States in their competition with China today is internal domestic division. And I don't see any solution. I try to escape another kind of trap, which is blaming only one side, because it's too easy. If you're a Democrat, it's only the fault of the Republicans. If you're a Republican, it's the Democrats. And you find so few people nowadays in the United States who are trying to explore a middle ground and listen to both camps and find some possible compromise. They're very, very few. I'm very worried about the state of the Union, the state of the US democracy. I think really that's the top problem. I go to the second set of questions. There was the educational system. That is a topic that fascinates me. Also because with my wife, we had this story of adoption so we know something about the educational system through the lives of our adoptive children. It's a very interesting system, which has become so different from the schools in many Western countries, especially now. And by the way, my wife is a teacher, so she knows about school systems in Europe, in the United States. When I'm thinking especially of the evolution of the educational system in the United States, I see schools that are pampering children, okay? Coddling. Children are always right. And sometimes if you want to be a little critical, you call the US teenagers snowflakes. Because like snowflakes, if they touch something hard, they will dissolve. They're not trained to hard things. The Chinese system is exactly the opposite. It's very, very tough, very competitive, very meritocratic, very selective. And this is where you see the heritage of Confucius, because one of the tenets of the Confucian heritage is how important it is to invest in education, how important it is to respect the elders and especially your teachers. So, you know, if in the United States a teenager gets a bad grade at school, now the parents go to meet the teacher and complain. In China, if a teenager gets a bad grade, the parents will be very hard on the teenager. And he or she will have to study much more. And the teacher is right, and the teenager is wrong. That's the Chinese way. Now, this system, of course, has also a lot of problems. I'm not being too, naive about the Chinese educational system. Sometimes it's been accused of being too rigid, not fostering creativity and innovation, and that's one possible issue with that system. Another one is that because it is so competitive and selective, you also have a social class structure, that you have private schools, very expensive, like in the United States, private schools, very expensive for the children of rich people, privileged people. You have all this industry, this new business of private tuition classes that will prepare young Chinese to win accession to the best US universities, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, etc. And by the way, this is a topic where Xi Jinping revealed once again his populist nature. He has launched a campaign against private tuition, the private tuition business, because it is an instrument for widening social inequalities. And you also asked me about the Chinese being more or less happy. I'm a bit skeptical. You know, there are worldwide inquiries about the degrees of happiness of people. I'm a bit skeptical, but on the average, the Chinese do not fare badly. They do not fare poorly in those indexes of happiness. Sorry.
No, I was asking if there were any polls rating the people's satisfaction in China.
There are, it's a United Nations-based index of happiness. And I think that China is basically in the middle. You know, I remember the top number 1, 2, 3, 4. You have always Scandinavian countries like Denmark, Norway. There's usually also South Korea, which is a very interesting case of a Confucian but democratic country. And China is basically in the middle. And happiness, how do you measure happiness is very complicated. And there are experts that have tried to measure it. One thing that is important to keep is historical perspective. For Chinese people, they can still compare their present situation to how their parents and their grandparents lived. And they think that they are very lucky. Whereas in some Western countries, European countries, United States, today's young people don't necessarily have higher expectations than their parents. Sometimes there's even been a lowering of expectations. So that's one thing that can impact on the happiness perception. Then I remember we had a question.
It's a priority for China to keep the Western markets open in order to foster economic growth.
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, that was the question about the middle income. Yes. The middle income trap and how is China able or not to have an economic growth that is not too much dependent on foreign markets. Well, let me start. I think you were also the one mentioning the pandemic effect. Anyway, the two things are very much linked because we are now in the middle of a very interesting debate whether the globalization as we knew it in the last 30 years is over, whether the global supply chains have become too overstretched, they're too unsecure, and we must try to have our suppliers near to home. And this is a debate very interesting for multinational corporations, but also for a country like Mexico. Do we need, in the United States, are we going to draw this lesson from the pandemic that we don't want to depend on China because it's too far away, it's politically unreliable, and we need to have shorter supply chain If the answer is yes, then there's a lot of new opportunities for the Mexican economy. And I think that part of the answer is becoming yes. What is happening with the, you know, all this inflation tensions, the unreliability of long distance maritime transportation, some very strategic US infrastructures like the port of Long Beach in Los Angeles, completely overwhelmed by the arrival of ships. That there's something that is making it really compelling that we rethink the global supply chains. The pandemic is just the latest episode in a number of crises. So it's not just because we want to have a kind of a new Cold War mentality, that we need to be very rational in assessing if it's in our best interest to have so much of our supply chain depending on China. But if you look at how things have gone in 2021, the dependency on China has not decreased one little bit. The year 2021 ended with the highest trade surplus for China with the rest of the world in history. China ended 2021 with $676 billions of trade surplus with the rest of the world. So for the time being, we are talking a lot about, you know, reviewing and reforming the supply chains, but very little has changed in reality. Something has been noticed, for instance, that some multinational corporations have started relocating their business from China to Vietnam. Textile, apparel, shoes, from China to Vietnam, to Cambodia, to Bangladesh. I don't really know about Mexico yet, but I'm very interested in analyzing the data if Mexico is one of the beneficiaries of this beginning of a relocation of the supply chains. But something might happen. It has not happened in big size until now. One final comment about the Washington consensus, the question on the Washington consensus. The Washington consensus have been it's also called the neoliberal ideology. It's been very important, but it's dead. It's been long dead. I think it died in 2008. And not only in China, not only because the Chinese, who had been somehow also influenced by the Washington consensus. So if you look at China, the Chinese economic policies in the 80s were very much dictated by the World Bank. World Bank executives were very influential in China. But then 2008 is really a turning point, where the Chinese leaders say, we don't have to learn anything from Washington. Washington is yesterday. We are tomorrow. But the same thing has happened in the United States. Today, the Washington consensus has been completely reversed on its head. Look at the monetary policies the United States applied since 2008. This huge creation of liquidity. The Federal Reserve under Ben Bernanke, under Janet Yellen, and now under Jerome Powell, they've been inundating the US economy and the world economy with dollars. This is the opposite of the Washington consensus. They have taken the old textbooks of economic science and they've thrown them out of the windows, and they've done the opposite. Same you can say about Keynesian public spending. Look at what has been the public spending of the United States between the last year of the Trump presidency and the first year of Biden. We have increased our public spending because of the COVID by 5 trillion US dollars. In order to find such an amount in proportion to the US GDP, such an amount of public spending, you have to go back to the Second World War. So this is really almost a revolution. And it's been applied by a Republican president and a Democratic president. So the Washington consensus is totally over, even in Washington.
En Washington. Bueno, pues son las 7:30. Yo quisiera en estos momentos agradecer a la Embajada de Italia, a COMEXI y a World Future Society, embajador, comendatore, presidente. Muchas gracias por haberme permitido estar el día de hoy en esta mesa extraordinaria. Quiero decir que había leído el libro de Rampini con un gusto enorme. Además tiene un estilo francamente agradable y he disfrutado enormemente su gratísima presentación el día de hoy. Yo les pido que lo despidamos con un gran aplauso.
Muchas gracias. Gracias.